Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, today we're diving deep into this case that's really captured the attention of true crime fans, for years now, the murder of Heather Rich. And you've given us a ton of stuff, court transcripts, investigative reports, even a whole podcast episode about this case. I mean, it's obvious you really want to get past the headlines and figure out what happened to this 16-year-old girl from Oklahoma.
Yeah, it's a story that really takes you into the heart of small town life, where things aren't always what they seem. And a teenage girl's disappearance, just sent shockwaves through the entire community.
And, from what I'm seeing, Heather's life, it wasn't all cheerleading and homecoming queen nominations like some people might think.
Right, the sources paint a picture of her dealing with all the normal teenage stuff, trying to fit in, pushing boundaries a bit. But there's also signs of some family problems, too, which adds another layer.
There's this thing about her arguing with her mom about a big phone bill the night she disappears.
Yeah.
It really got to me, you know? It's a reminder that behind all the headlines, there was a real girl, just like any of us, with real problems.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how those everyday teenage stresses, did they play a role in what she did that night?
And then she just vanishes. Everyone seems to think she ran away. Why was that the main theory, especially since her parents were so sure she wouldn't do that?
Well, you think about small town life back in the 90s. The idea of a teenager, especially a girl running away to rebel or, get back at her parents, it wasn't that crazy. Plus, Heather had been suspended from school for drinking at a school event, so maybe people thought she was in a rebellious phase.
But you mentioned her parents insisted that running away wasn't her style. And the reports talk about her room, no purse, no clothes, not even her makeup was gone. It's like she just left for a minute and poof.
Chilling detail. It makes you wonder, did the police take her disappearance seriously enough right away? Did that assumption about her running away slow things down and maybe they missed crucial evidence?
You mentioning the initial response reminds me of something in one of the reports that really stood out to me. It's about Heather's mom running into her ex-boyfriend, Randy Wood. He was the football captain, a big deal in their town. She said she was struck by how detached he seemed, almost robotic.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely strange. Makes you wonder if it was just shock or was there something more to it?
Days turn into a week. The search for Heather gets bigger, and hope starts to fade. Then the awful news comes: a rancher finds a body in a creek miles away in Texas.
That's when the reality hits. And the crime scene details, they're tough to handle.
9 shotgun blasts. I mean, that's brutal. It's more than just a random act of violence. There's rage there, maybe even premeditation. Yeah. It's unsettling.
Makes you think, could this have been prevented? Were there signs something like this could happen?
And then on top of everything else, the investigation hits a snag jurisdictional issues. Oklahoma, where she disappeared, and Texas, where they found her body. They got to figure out who's in charge.
This isn't just paperwork. Jurisdictional stuff can really mess things up. Different states, different laws, different resources. It can impact the whole case.
And get this, the crime scene's a mess. The bridge where they think Heather was killed, it's covered in shell casings.
Talk about a needle in a haystack. Trying to find the exact ones that tie to Heather's murder must have been incredibly difficult.
So with the investigation going, and the pressure on suspicion falls on 3 guys. Randy Wood, Heather's ex-boyfriend, his friend Josh Bagwell, and this older guy, Curtis Gamble, who had a bit of a troubled past.
It's interesting to compare them. You've got Wood and Bagwell, typical high schoolers, part of the popular crowd. Then you have Gamble, an outsider known for causing trouble.
There's this disturbing story in one of the reports about Gamble bragging that he'd become famous for kidnapping and killing a girl. Chilling to read, knowing what happened. Makes you wonder, did he want to be notorious?
It definitely raises questions about what was going on in his head. Was it just talk, or was it a sign of something darker?
And then completely out of the blue, Curtis Gamble confesses. He talks about a night of partying, claims Heather had sex with Josh willingly, and then things went bad, ending with her murder.
But his confession isn't totally clear. Some things change, his timeline's off, and you gotta ask, why'd he confess? Is he truly sorry, or is he trying to manipulate the situation?
And here's where it gets even more complicated. Randy Wood comes forward with his own story. He says Gamble was the one who assaulted Heather, and he and Bagwell were forced to help get rid of her body.
Now it's a he said, she said, he said situation. It's tough to know what really happened. Conflicting stories can really throw off an investigation.
And just to make things even more interesting, Josh Bagwell, a friend from a wealthy family, decides to stay silent, won't cooperate with the police at all.
That silence speaks volumes, right? Is he guilty? Is it a legal strategy cooked up by his lawyers? Or is he just terrified?
So now the prosecutor, Tim Cole's got a puzzle box of stories Everyone's blaming someone else, and three young guys facing serious consequences. What a mess. What does he do next?
He's in a tough spot. He needs to get justice for Heather and her family. He knows it's hard to prosecute all three at once, and maybe hoping to get someone to talk. He makes a controversial choice. He offers Curtis Gamble a plea deal.
Oh, now this is getting good. What were the terms of this deal, and why'd he do it? Was it a get-out-of-jail-free card?
Not exactly. It's more like reducing the punishment. If Gamble testifies against Josh Bagwell, specifically about Bagwell's role in the murder, the prosecution agrees to drop the death penalty.
Wow, so basically the prosecution's making a deal with a guy who admits to being part of the murder. How did Heather's family feel about that?
It must have been a horrible decision for them. Imagine wanting justice, but also knowing one of the people involved might get a lighter sentence. They agreed, though, maybe because they thought it was the best way to ensure everyone responsible was held accountable, especially Josh Bagwell. They were worried his family's money and influence might protect him from real punishment.
That's a decision loaded with ethical issues. And it sets the stage for a trial that's going to be a wild ride. Everyone fighting for their future and the truth getting harder and harder to find. This deep dive is intense already. I can't wait to see what happens next.
It reminds us that in cases like this, justice is rarely simple.
Yeah.
And as we'll see, the trial brings even more twists and turns that made us question everything we thought we knew about guilt, innocence, and what truth really is.
So the trial for Heather's murder starts exactly a year after she was killed. That must have been so hard for her family having to go through it all again as the trial's happening.
Absolutely. The timing definitely makes it even heavier. And inside the courtroom, you have three defendants, each one with their own legal plan, which makes this whole thing even more complicated.
Right, let's go through what each one is doing. We know Curtis Gamble's sticking with his plea deal. He's going to testify against Josh Bagwell so he can avoid the death penalty. But Bagwell, saying he's innocent, claims he wasn't directly involved in the actual murder.
And then there's Randy Wood, Heather's ex-boyfriend. He throws a wrench in things by deciding he doesn't want his plea deal right before it's finalized. He'd rather risk a life sentence for murder than take a shorter sentence for conspiracy. It was a total shock to everyone, even the prosecutor.
I don't get it. Why risk it all when he had a deal? What was he thinking?
It's a good question. Wood said he wanted to tell his side of the story, that he owed it to Heather and her family. Some people think it was guilt, like he was trying to clear his conscience. Others think he was naive. Maybe he thought he could convince the jury he was innocent, even though there was a lot of evidence against him.
But wouldn't that mean he'd have to admit to being involved in some way, which could totally backfire?
Exactly. By saying no to the plea deal, he opened himself up to a much worse sentence. It's something legal experts still talk about today. It shows how complicated things get in a trial.
And I bet the media went crazy with this case.
Yeah.
Small town, brutal murder star athletes involved. It's like something out of a TV show.
For sure. The reports say the trial was a huge deal. The courtroom was packed every day. People wanted to hear the stories and see what would happen. You have to wonder how all that attention being on camera all the time affected everyone, the families, the jury.
Like that small town pressure got cranked up a notch. Everyone's watching, judging, making up their own minds.
Right. And in the middle of all that, the prosecution and the defense present their arguments. The prosecution's pushing this idea that all three guys were involved in Heather's murder, even if only one actually shot her. They talk about what they did before, during, and after that night, saying that because they tried to hide the murder, it proves they're all guilty.
So they're saying it was a team effort, a horrible pact to keep a secret. What did the defense teams do to fight that?
Well, Curtis Gamble, as part of his plea deal, testified against Josh Bagwell. He said Bagwell planned the whole thing to kill Heather. It was risky for the prosecution because Gamble had already changed his story a few times, so who knows if he's telling the truth.
Yeah, maybe the jury thought he was just saying what the prosecution wanted him to say to save himself. Did his testimony convince the jury in the end?
Even with all the doubts, the jury found Josh Bagwell guilty of both capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. It seems like the prosecution's strategy worked at least a little bit, even though Bagwell's family was rich and powerful.
So Bagwell couldn't separate himself from the murder. What about Randy Wood? Did his decision to not take the deal and tell his own story work out for him?
Nope, it didn't. He went up there and told his version of things. He said he was forced to be involved, not that he wanted to be, but the jury still found him guilty of capital murder. Just like Bagwell, he got a life sentence.
That's rough. He tried to control the story to make himself look better, but he ended up with the same punishment as the guy the jury thought planned it all. It seems like trying to do the right thing really backfired.
It shows just how much is at stake in a trial. Even if you have good intentions, things can go wrong fast when the law gets involved.
What about Curtis Gamble? He held the prosecution, right? So I guess he got a shorter sentence.
Yeah, because he testified against Bagwell. They took the death penalty off the table, but he was still found guilty of capital murder and got 2 life sentences back to back. So he didn't get the worst possible punishment, but he's still in prison for good.
So all three of them are locked up serving life sentences for something that happened when they were just barely adults. It's a reminder that your choices matter, especially when someone's life is taken. You'd think that's the end of the story, right? Justice is served, case closed. But there's more, isn't there? What happens next?
You're right, it's not over. A few years into their sentences, Curtis Gamble and Josh Bagwell remember they were blaming each other during the trial. They actually team up to escape from prison. It's crazy. Everyone was shocked, and it made people question how secure the prison really was.
What a twist. It's hard to believe they'd work together after all that went down.
Right.
What were they thinking and how did they do it?
It was bold and desperate. They overpowered a guard, stole a car, and managed to get away for a bit. I bet the whole town was terrified when they heard those guys were out. The nightmare everyone thought was over was back.
They must have been desperate, feeling like they had nothing to lose. But weren't they worried about getting caught? Wouldn't that make their sentences even longer?
You'd think so, but sometimes logic goes out the window when you're desperate. They were facing life in prison, and maybe escape was their only shot at freedom, no matter how small of it. It also says something about how they were thinking maybe they weren't really facing the reality of what they did and how much pain they caused.
So they're on the run. What happened? Did they try to disappear, or were they hoping to prove they were innocent somehow?
Their freedom didn't last long. They got caught at a convenience store where they were holding someone hostage. There was a standoff with U.S. Marshals, and they ended up back in prison. Their escape plan failed, and now they have even worse records and less chance of ever getting out.
So back to where they started, maybe even worse off. What are the chances they ever get out of prison? Will they be there forever?
Bagwell and Wood could get parole in 2036. Gamble's eligible even sooner in 2026. But considering what they did their escape attempt and how much attention this case got, it's really unlikely any of them will be getting out anytime soon.
Sounds pretty grim for those guys. Their choices ruined their lives and left a lot of damage behind.
It shows how much impact every action has. It's not just the people involved, but the whole community. And in this case, the effects of Heather's murder are still being felt even years after the trial.
Speaking of those effects, one of the most surprising things is what the prosecutor Tim Cole said years after the trial. He publicly said he regretted how he handled Randy Wood's case.
It's not every day you hear a prosecutor admit they might have been wrong, especially in a big case like this. What did Cole regret, and why did he change his mind?
He felt like he was too tough on Wood, who, after all, didn't actually shoot Heather. He wished he'd offered Wood a deal for conspiracy instead of murder. He admitted that Wood's testimony was really important in getting Bagwell and Gamble convicted.
That's a big deal. And it makes you think about how complicated the justice system is. You've got the need to get justice for the victim and hold the people responsible accountable. But there's also the human side of it, the fact that prosecutors are people too, and they can be influenced by pressure or their own biases.
It also shows how emotionally draining these cases can be, even for the people whose job it is to uphold the law. Cole admitting he had regrets reminds us that even experienced professionals struggle with tough choices, and things don't always turn out how they planned.
And it shows that getting justice isn't always about a perfect outcome. Sometimes it's about making tough choices and realizing that even when someone's found guilty, there might not be a sense of closure.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Before we finish this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to look at the bigger picture. What does this story tell us about small towns, teenage relationships, and how long the effects of violence last?
It's like we're peeling back the layers of this perfect-looking small town and seeing the secrets and rumors that hide underneath. It shows how appearances can fool you and how much people want to keep things looking normal, even if it means hiding the truth.
It also shows how complicated teenage relationships can be, how power plays out in groups, and how much pressure there is to fit in and not be the odd one out. In this case, those pressures and maybe some bad decisions led to a terrible ending.
Yeah, Heather's story reminds us that even in places that seem safe, bad things can happen. It's a warning about peer pressure, the need to talk openly, and for adults to pay attention when young people are struggling or doing risky stuff.
And we can't forget about alcohol and drugs. They were a big part of what happened that night. It makes you think about how easy it is for teenagers to get alcohol and drugs and how bad decisions can have devastating consequences when people are under the influence.
You're right. We need to talk more about substance abuse, making good choices, and the risks involved. Parents, teachers, community leaders, everyone needs to be part of creating a culture where young people can make healthy choices and get help when they need it.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's shown us that this case is much more complicated than it seemed at first. We've looked at the legal stuff, the different stories, and how this tragedy affected everyone involved. But there's one more thing I think we need to talk about.
You mean sexual assault and consent? It's something that's often ignored in big murder cases, but it's a huge part of understanding what happened to Heather.
Exactly. Curtis Gamble said Heather willingly had sex with Josh Bagwell, but she was really drunk. So it's hard to say if she could really consent. This makes the case even more complicated. It blurs the lines between a terrible accident and a planned act of violence.
It's a good point. When alcohol's involved, especially with young people, consent gets tricky. It's important to remember that consent has to be given freely and clearly, and being drunk can make it hard to make good decisions.
It's a serious reminder that we need to talk openly about consent boundaries in healthy relationships, especially with young people. We need to give them the knowledge and tools to handle risky situations and to understand how important it is to respect themselves and others.
This case, with all its twists and turns, shows us some of the big problems we still face as a society. It reminds us that even in small towns, secrets can be hidden right in front of you, and finding justice can be a long and difficult process.
This has been a really intense deep dive, but it's been important. It's a story that'll stick with us, I think. What really stood out to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. It really makes you think about all those what-ifs, especially when you have these young people making choices that end up having such terrible consequences. Were there any warning signs?
Yeah.
Things that could have been done differently? It makes you wonder about everyone involved, the community, the parents, even the school. Did they miss any chances to step in and prevent this?
It's a question that goes way beyond just this case. If we can figure out those moments, those missed opportunities to maybe change things, then we can learn from what happened and maybe prevent it from happening again.
So let's start with the community. Wara, Oklahoma. It sounds like a typical small town. Everybody knows each other. Does that make it harder to see and deal with things like underage drinking, drug use, or even abusive relationships?
That's a good point. On one hand, you have this close community, everyone's looking out for each other, but then there's also this pressure to fit in to keep up appearances and not cause trouble. It's possible that in a town like Wara, people were afraid to speak up if they saw something wrong.
Like they're all watching out for each other, but also looking away from anything that might mess up their town's image.
Exactly. And then there's the whole thing about who has power in a small town. Some families have more influence, some people are seen as untouchable. Maybe that played a role in how Heather's disappearance was handled at first. The assumption that she ran away. Maybe that was because of who she knew.
What about the parents? The reports mention Heather was suspended from school for drinking at a school event. Did her parents miss a chance to step in and deal with whatever was going on with her?
It's easy to judge after the fact, but being a parent is hard. Maybe Heather's parents didn't understand what she was going through, or they felt like they couldn't control her. Teenagers are good at hiding their problems, and sometimes when they're acting out, it's really a cry for help.
It shows that parents aren't perfect.
Yeah.
They need help too. They need resources to help them through those tough teenage years.
You're right. And it's not just the parents. Schools have a big responsibility, too, to create a safe and supportive environment. Were there signs that Heather was having problems, that she was getting into risky stuff? Did any teachers or counselors try to reach out to connect with her?
It's so sad to think that maybe if someone had talked to her at the right time, if someone had listened without judging, things might have been different.
It's a tough thought. And we can't go back, but we can learn from this. We can push for better support systems in schools, for resources that help both students and parents deal with things like substance abuse, mental health, and healthy relationships.
It's about creating a safety net, a community where young people feel like they can ask for help and adults know how to give it. It's about understanding that even in places that seem perfect, bad things can happen, and we all need to work together to shine a light on those deep corners.
And even with all the right systems in place, sometimes tragedies still happen. But maybe if we're more aware, if we talk openly and support each other, we can reduce the risks and create a world where stories like Heather's don't happen as often.
That's a powerful thought. It brings us back to the prosecutor, Tim Cole, and how he said he regretted how he handled Randy Wood's case. He seems to be wrestling with this idea that even in the justice system, there's room for improvement, for looking back and admitting that sometimes trying to get justice can have unintended consequences.
It's pretty amazing that he's willing to question his own decisions years later. It shows his integrity, his humanity, and his understanding that the legal system, while it's meant to be fair, is run by people, and people make mistakes.
It reminds us that we can all learn from our mistakes, and it highlights the importance of talking about criminal justice reform, about making sure sentences are fair and making sure the system works for both victors and the accused.
It's about finding a balance between holding people accountable and giving them a chance to change, between punishment and rehabilitation.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind. It's been full of twists and turns, sad moments, and things that really make you think. It's a story that reminds us life is complicated. Our choices matter, and even in the darkest times, there's always hope for learning and growing.
It pushes us to look deeper, to see things from different angles, and to talk about the issues that affect our communities and our society.
We've explored the legal ins and outs, the social dynamics, the psychology behind what happened. We've talked about the roles of parents, schools, and the justice system in preventing these kinds of tragedies. And we've wrestled with that question of could things have gone differently?
It's been a deep dive into a case that seemed simple at first, but the more we dug, the more complicated it got.
Thanks for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive. I think this is a story that will stick with us for a long time. What stood out to you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.